1960 Washington. They want Castro gone, but they need to swear they never touched him. So a question gets asked in the shadows. When a government can't pull the trigger, who does it hire? The answer leads to an envelope, a bar table, and men who don't salute flags. Washington, D.C., 1960. The Cold War isn't just a map of red and blue countries. It's a discipline, a habit of doing things that can't be admitted, can't be signed, can't be put into a filing cabinet with a name on the tab. And that's the problem the United States runs into the moment Fidel Castro takes Cuba. Because overthrow is one thing, assassination is another. And in the early 1960s, the US government wants Castro gone, but it also wants the option to say, honestly and publicly, that it had nothing to do with it. So the question becomes brutally simple. If a state needs a man removed but cannot be seen removing him, who do you hire? That question leads to one of the darkest outsourcing decisions of the era, an arrangement that later investigations would drag into the light. Elements of the CIA looking for help from underworld figures tied to the American Mafia, men with their own motives, their own grudges, and their own sense of how business is done. Not a battlefield, not a courtroom, a deal. To understand why anyone inside an intelligence service would even consider that route, you have to understand what Cuba meant to them in that moment. Cuba wasn't just 90 miles away. It was a symbol with teeth, a revolutionary government that had humiliated a US-backed dictator, seized property, aligned with the Soviet Union, and proved that a small country in America's backyard could slip out of Washington's control. In the logic of the time, that wasn't merely a geopolitical shift, it was a contagious idea. Inside the CIA, Castro isn't treated like a normal foreign leader. He's treated like a wildfire, something you don't negotiate with, something you stop before it jumps to the next tree. But stopping him carries constraints. Open military action risks escalation with Moscow. Direct assassination, if traced, is a propaganda catastrophe and potentially a constitutional crisis at home. The whole operation has to be built around a single principle that becomes a kind of religion in covert work: plausible deniability. Deniability requires distance, and distance requires intermediaries. This is where the cast of characters hardens into shape: the handler, the fixer, and the quiet space between them where nothing is written down. The handler is the kind of man who doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He has access, phones that get answered, doors that open, budgets that exist in shadows. In later accounts and investigations, names emerge from this world: senior security officials and case officers associated with the CIA's operational side, men whose careers were built in the belief that the Cold War demanded ugly tools. The fixer is different. He doesn't have authority. He has reach. He knows who can get close to a target. He knows what kind of payment actually buys action. He knows how to keep a mouth shut, not with loyalty, but with leverage. In this story, the fixers circle around a very specific ecosystem: the American underworld's Cuban connections. Before Castro, Havana had been a profit machine for US mob figures: casinos, hotels, protection, and cash. When Castro's government moved against organized crime and gambling interests, it didn't just disrupt vice, it stripped powerful men of a revenue stream and a status symbol. For them, Castro wasn't a political problem. He was a thief. That shared hostility is exactly what makes the outsourcing tempting. If you're a CIA planner in 1960, looking at the board, you might think, these men want him dead anyway. They have contacts in Cuba. They're deniable. And if the attempt fails, the US government can claim it was just criminals settling scores. It sounds clean, at least on paper, except nothing in that arrangement stays clean for long. Because the moment you bring in the underworld, you aren't just renting talent. You're importing a set of incentives that don't answer to the flag. The Mafia in this context isn't one person, one office, one chain of command. Later reporting and government inquiries would point to well-known figures and intermediaries: Johnny Roselli, a slick connector with Hollywood polish and underworld credibility; Sam Giancana, a Chicago boss with ego to match his reputation; Santo Traficante Jr., to Florida mob leader with deep Havana history. Whether every detail of every meeting is remembered perfectly is debated, but the general shape of the relationship and the CIA's flirtation with this channel is documented enough to stain the era. Now narrow the camera down from geopolitics to a single room, because this whole story lives and dies in rooms like this. A hotel lobby bar, early evening. The lighting is soft enough to hide expressions, bright enough to see who's watching. A low hum of civilians, salesmen, tourists, people with ordinary problems. In the corner, an ashtray fills slowly, cigarette after cigarette, because nobody in that world sits still without doing something with their hands. A man arrives carrying nothing that looks like government. No uniform, no badge, no briefcase stamped with an eagle. He orders a drink he doesn't taste. He is careful with his posture, careful with his eyes. Across from him is the kind of man who smiles as a default setting. The smile isn't warmth, it's insulation. He talks like he's telling a story, but he's watching for reactions the way a safecracker listens for clicks. No one says Castro out loud at first. No one says kill. The language is always softened, always angled. A problem, a remedy, an operation. If someone is experienced, they understand that euphemisms aren't politeness, they're legal armor. And then the anchor appears, an envelope, not thick, not dramatic, just an ordinary, forgettable envelope, exactly the kind of object that can cross a room without drawing a headline. It lands on the table near the ashtray, close enough to claim, far enough to deny. Inside there's money, or the promise of it. Sometimes there's also an item, small, specific, designed to do one thing quietly. In the stories that survived, the most haunting item is almost absurd in its simplicity. Poison pills. Not a rifle shot, not a bombing, a pharmaceutical-sized solution to a geopolitical problem. The logic is merciless. Poison doesn't announce itself. Poison can look like illness, like fate, like the natural collapse of a body under stress. Poison lets everyone involved pretend they didn't just try to rewrite history with murder. But poison also demands proximity. Someone has to handle it. Someone has to place it. Someone has to get near Castro's food, his drink, his routine. And the CIA, an institution built to recruit and run human assets, faces an obstacle that money and training can't instantly solve. Castro is guarded, suspicious, and surrounded by loyalists. He's not a stationary target. He's a moving fortress, so the planners look for a person who can get close without triggering the alarms that a government operative might trigger. This is where the Underworld channel becomes more than a theory. It becomes a method. Because organized crime, especially with pre-revolution Cuban links, has something intelligence services sometimes lack: an existing network of compromised relationships, a bartender with a past, a casino worker who needs money, a supplier who can be leaned on, a friend of a friend who can deliver a package without asking questions. In other words, access without fingerprints. That's the pitch, that's the temptation, and it carries a deeper, more dangerous side effect. The moment you treat the underworld as a tool, you grant it legitimacy it didn't have before. A fixer who can say truthfully, "I'm doing business with people from Washington," becomes a fixer with a crown. His status rises, his leverage grows, his protection expands. Even if the government thinks it's controlling him, he now has something priceless, a story that can't be publicly denied without exposing the very secrets the state is desperate to keep. And that changes the balance of power, not only in Cuba, but in the United States. Because the contract isn't just a contract to kill Castro, it is a contract that quietly reorders relationships between state and crime, between law and deniability, between what a government claims to be and what it allows itself to do when it's afraid. That's the core problem we're dealing with in this case file. Not simply, did they try to poison Castro? Evidence and testimony suggest that plots were discussed and materials prepared, though many attempts failed or never reached execution. The real question is the decision itself. Why would an intelligence agency, with all its resources, decide that the safest way to remove a head of state was to pass the job into the hands of men who ran gambling, extortion, and murder for profit? What did the agency believe it was buying? Skill, access, deniability, or simply a layer of moral distance? And once that kind of deal is made, who actually benefits from it? Because in the underworld, every favor has a price, and the most expensive favors are the ones that can't ever be acknowledged. Once you accept that principle, distance equals safety, you start building a pipeline. And the pipeline in this story is the part that matters more than the poison. Because the CIA didn't walk into a Mafia clubhouse and announce itself. It moved the way it always moved, through cutouts, intermediaries, people whose entire job was to keep the real sponsor invisible. According to later government investigations, one of the key buffers in this arrangement was Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent turned businessman with a foot in the private world and a habit of taking discreet assignments. He's important not because he was a mobster, but because he could sit with mob-connected figures without the meeting immediately smelling like Langley. And on the CIA side, you're not looking at a random field officer with a wild idea. You're looking at the kind of internal authority that could authorize contact with criminals while still believing it was responsible because it was controlled. In accounts that surfaced later, CIA security officials were involved in initiating or managing these discussions, men whose mandate was protecting operations, not protecting reputations. So the deal begins the way these things always begin, with language that sounds like business, not ideology. The pitch is simple. The United States has a problem in Cuba. There are men who want that problem solved. There is money available, and there is a desire stated clearly to keep the sponsor untraceable. From the fixer's side, the math is just as cold. If you're someone like Johnny Roselli, you understand power better than patriotism. Roselli's reputation, in later retellings, is that of a connector, smooth, credible, with serious people, capable of moving between worlds. He doesn't need to be the one who poisons anyone. His value is that he knows who can talk to whom without getting everyone killed in the first 10 minutes. And Roselli isn't going to do something like this for a handshake and a promise. He will want terms, he will want compensation, and most importantly, he will want the kind of protection that comes from being useful to men who don't exist on paper. That's the core miscalculation built into the outsourcing logic. The CIA is thinking in terms of a one-time transaction, deliver a capability, achieve an outcome, end the relationship. The Underworld is thinking in terms of an ongoing position. Once you've done one job for a powerful customer, you're not done, you're established. So the pipeline expands. Roselli is only one node. Another is Sam Giancana in Chicago, and another is Santo Traficante Jr., or in Florida. Men with their own empires and their own reasons to hate Castro's Cuba. Traficante especially had pre-revolution Havana ties that made him more than a name on a chart. He represented the ghost of the old Cuba, casino money, access, influence that Castro had buried. To a CIA planner, these are assets with a shared motive. To themselves, they're businessmen being offered a government-scale opportunity. And here's the detail that makes this story feel less like a spy thriller and more like a moral collapse. The money involved, as described later, isn't even vast by government standards. Figures mentioned in public inquiries suggest payments discussed in the tens or hundreds of thousands, not billions, not war budgets, but the kind of cash that can fit inside an envelope. That is what a head of state is reduced to in the covert marketplace, a price that can be carried across a hotel lobby. Now about the poison. Poison sounds elegant to people who don't have to deliver it. On paper, it's the perfect tool for deniability, silent, clean, medically ambiguous. But operationally, it creates a nightmare because it requires the kind of access that is hardest to manufacture. A gun only needs a line of sight. Poison needs trust, routine, and an unguarded moment. That's why so many assassination plots, real, rumored, exaggerated, or half-built, keep circling the same concept: someone inside Castro's orbit, someone who can reach a kitchen, a glass, a personal item, and that's where the outsourcing decision shows its teeth. If the CIA had used official channels, military, diplomatic, even direct paramilitary action, the risk would have been enormous, but the chain of command would have been clear. By using criminals as intermediaries, the chain of command becomes a fog. Nobody can be sure who's in control. And in that fog, plans multiply, schemes collide, and every participant starts protecting themselves first. Later accounts describe poison pills prepared for use, small capsules intended to be slipped into a drink or food. The supposed delivery path often hinges on a compromised insider, a contact in a restaurant, a member of staff, someone close enough to place the pills without being searched. The handler imagines a clean insertion, pill goes in, target goes down, no trace back to anyone. The fixer imagines something else entirely, that every person in that chain can be bought twice, can panic, can talk, can disappear. And if the operation goes sideways, the fixer's priority will be survival, not success. So even at the planning stage, you can feel the mismatch. Government planners want a controlled, predictable outcome. Underworld operators know outcomes are never controlled, only managed after the fact. That difference alone is enough to make an easy assassination attempt collapse before it starts. And the attempts did collapse, over and over. Not always because Castro was superhuman or because the CIA was incompetent, but because the real world is hostile to neat solutions. People get cold feet, access evaporates, Cuban security tightens, a contact can't get close. A person who promised they could deliver suddenly realizes they are volunteering to die if caught. In this part of the story, it's important to be honest about what we can and can't know. Some details come from later testimony, from Senate investigations in the 1970s, from memoirs, from journalists chasing the smoke trail of a system designed not to leave footprints. Some of it is contested, some of it may be embellished. But the pattern is clear enough to matter. The CIA explored, discussed, and in certain ways facilitated contact with organized crime-linked figures in pursuit of anti-Castro operations, including poisoning concepts, because it believed this created deniability. Now let's talk about the cost of that belief, because it shows up immediately in the way everyone starts using everyone else. For the CIA, the Mafia channel is a tool, a disposable blade. If it works, great. If it fails, it's just criminals. For the Mafia, the CIA channel is insurance, an invisible shield, because if you can credibly imply you've been useful to powerful men, it changes how other criminals treat you, how police treat you, how politicians treat you. It changes your leverage in disputes that have nothing to do with Cuba. And for Castro's side, Cuban intelligence, security services, the Soviet advisors watching closely, the mere possibility of these plots becomes fuel. Every rumor of a plot is propaganda gold, proof that the United States is willing to do anything, proof that the revolution is under siege, proof that hard security is justified, so even failed attempts can still reshape reality. This is what the deal and the message look like in practice. The deal isn't just the envelope and the pills. The deal is the moment the US government, or elements within it, signals to criminals that they are acceptable partners when the stakes are high enough. And the message isn't just aimed at Castro, it echoes outward, to allies, to rivals, to everyone inside the American system who is paying attention. It says the rules can bend, the moral line can move, and if you are useful in the shadows, you can be invited into rooms you were never supposed to enter. But there is another message too, one that the CIA may not have intended to send. Because every time you outsource violence, you train your subcontractor to understand your fear. And fear is leverage. The moment the underworld understands that the state wants something it can't officially do, the underworld learns the state has limits. And once criminals learn your limits, they stop treating you like a government and start treating you like a customer. By the time these contacts are in motion, by the time pills are discussed and couriers are imagined, the relationship has already done its damage. Even if Castro survives, even if no pill ever reaches its target, the outsourcing decision has created a new kind of vulnerability, a channel where denial is purchased at the price of dependence. And that's where part 3 will go next. Because in this story, the most dangerous thing isn't that the plan might succeed, it's that the plan doesn't succeed quickly, and the relationship stays alive long enough to mutate into something neither side can fully control. And once a relationship like that is alive, it starts behaving like a living thing. It wants food, it wants protection, it wants to keep breathing. On the CIA side, the pressure doesn't ease. Castro stays in power, the Bay of Pigs collapses into humiliation, Soviet influence hardens, and every failure makes the next plan feel more urgent, more justified, more necessary. On the underworld side, the same logic applies, but with different motives. If you're a fixer, you don't measure success only by whether Castro falls. You measure success by whether your position rises. Because even a failed contract can be profitable if it buys you something else: access, status, insulation from law enforcement heat, or the ability to whisper at the right time to the right person, "You don't want to touch me. I've done work for people bigger than you." That's the trap hidden inside plausible deniability. Deniability isn't free. It's purchased by giving someone else a piece of your power, and that power doesn't stay neatly contained. In the short term, the CIA likely believed it could manage this like any other asset relationship: keep the criminals at arm's length, route communication through cutouts, pay cash, never write names down, and if anything goes wrong, burn the channel. But there's a flaw in that thinking, and it's a flaw every intelligence service eventually learns the hard way. You can cut off an agent. You can cut off a mercenary. You can cut off a supplier. You cannot easily cut off a criminal organization that thrives on secrets. Because they don't need paperwork. They don't need to win in court. They only need to survive long enough to trade what they know. And in this story, the Underworld's most valuable product isn't poison. It's the fact that the conversation happened at all. Years later, when these episodes became part of congressional investigations, especially the Senate's Church Committee in the mid-1970s, the exposure did what covert planners fear most. It didn't merely embarrass an agency. It challenged the idea that the state could use illegal violence as a tool without eventually facing the consequences. The revelations didn't land like a single bombshell. They landed like a slow, steady leak, pieces of testimony, names and fragments of operations that had been built to leave no trace. And yet traces remained, because human beings remember, and because secrets are never as quiet as the men who hold them believe. By then, the Cold War context had shifted, but the moral problem was the same. What happens to a country's rulebook when it decides some goals are too important for its own laws? That question mattered not only for Cuba, but for the internal balance of power in the United States. Because once it became public that the CIA had considered or pursued assassination plots, and that organized crime figures had been contacted, the damage spread in multiple directions at once. First, it damaged credibility. Not the kind of credibility that wins elections, but the kind that holds alliances together. If your allies suspect you outsource murders, they start wondering what you might outsource against them when the math changes. Second, it damaged oversight. The more the public learned, the more it became clear that secrecy had grown faster than accountability. That fuels distrust, and distrust becomes its own kind of national security problem. Third, and this is the most important for our Power Files lens, it quietly confirmed something the Underworld already believed: that the state, when cornered, negotiates. Not openly, not honorably, but it negotiates. And criminals notice that. So who did this decision empower? In the narrowest sense, it empowered the fixers, the intermediaries, who could move between worlds. A man like Roselli, positioned as a connector, becomes invaluable precisely because he's hard to categorize. He isn't just muscle. He isn't just a boss. He's a bridge. Bridges collect tolls. And it empowered the broader idea inside organized crime that politics and crime are not separate universes. They're adjacent markets. If the CIA can treat criminals as assets for a foreign policy problem, then criminals can treat government needs as another hustle. But who did it endanger? It endangered everyone who had to keep the secret, because the irony of outsourcing is that it increases the number of people who can betray you. Each new cutout isn't just a layer of protection, it's another mouth that might one day talk. It also endangered the agency itself, not in the immediate, tactical sense, though botched operations can get people killed, but in the strategic sense, it invited the possibility of blackmail, manipulation, and reputational collapse. Even the suggestion of collaboration with organized crime can become a weapon in someone else's hands. And it endangered the line between state power and criminal power, because once that line blurs, it doesn't snap back cleanly. The next time an emergency arrives, the argument becomes easier. We've done it before. Now, what about the people at the center of the supposed operation? Castro and the Cuban state. Castro survived. He survived plots, invasions, sabotage attempts, and decades of pressure. That survival became part of his political armor. Every failed attempt strengthened the story that he was the hunted revolutionary who stood up to a superpower and lived. And that story had real effects. It justified crackdowns. It justified tighter security. It justified a permanent posture of siege. So in a strange way, the outsourcing decision, whether it ever came close to success operationally, still fed Castro's resilience politically. Even rumors of assassination attempts can harden a regime if they validate its narrative. This is why covert violence is never only about the target. It's about the story that forms around the attempt. And the story that formed here was toxic, a superpower so desperate to remove one man that it explored handing the job to criminals. But there's another layer, one that makes this a true deal story, not just an assassination story. Think about the people inside the CIA who would have had to sign off, even informally, on something like this. Some of them likely believed they were protecting their country. In the Cold War mindset, the argument would have sounded clean. Castro is a threat. We need options. The Soviets play dirty. We can't afford moral purity. Others might have been motivated by career incentives, the pressure to produce results, to show aggression, to keep up with rivals inside the bureaucracy. In intelligence work, success is often invisible, but failure is loud. That creates a dangerous internal economy, where risky plans can feel like the only plans. And then there's the simplest motive of all, frustration. When the official road is blocked, the unofficial road looks tempting, but frustration is not strategy. And that's the takeaway that matters for this channel's promise. The mechanics of power. The decision to outsource a political assassination to underworld fixers wasn't only a tactic, it was a signal about how power behaves under stress. It showed that when institutions fear losing control, they may borrow the methods of the very forces they claim to oppose. And once you borrow those methods, you don't borrow them alone, you borrow the consequences. In the end, the poison pills for Castro became less important than what the attempt revealed, that there are moments in history where the state doesn't just fight its enemies, it starts bargaining with its own shadow. A quiet handoff across a table, a forgettable envelope, an ashtray filling up while two men speak in careful half-sentences. That is the Cold War at ground level. Not flags, not speeches. A deal made to be deniable. And the most dangerous part of a deniable deal isn't the action you take. It's the partner you choose. Because that partner doesn't disappear when the operation ends. He remembers, he adapts, and he waits for the next time you need him. Because once you've proven you're willing to call, the phone will ring both ways. In the next case file, keep that thought in your pocket. The underworld doesn't fear the law as much as it fears being irrelevant, and nothing makes it more relevant than being invited, even once, into the machinery of state power.